Well, good afternoon to everyone. I need to apologize as I do this introduction because I just lost my voice this morning, but I'm feeling okay. I'm Nancy Netzer, director of the McMullen Museum, and I want to welcome you all to the Thomas J. Flatlick Irish Studies and Museum Current Lecture by Declan McGonagle, who has been a seminal figure in the interpretation and international advancement of Irish contemporary art for nearly 4 decades. As director of the Orchard Gallery in Derry from 1978 to 1990, he was shortlisted for a Turner Prize. During that time, he also held the post of Director of Exhibitions for the Institute of Contemporary Art in London. In 1990, he became the founding director of the Irish Museum of Modern Art, where he served until 2001. And from 2008 until this past year, he was director of the National College of Art and Design in Dublin, from which he lent the splendid Harry Clark window in our exhibition last year entitled The Arts and Crafts Movement, Making It Irish. In all of these roles, and in his direction of public art projects, Declan McGonagle has distinguished himself as an outstanding, innovative leader in our field. He has continuously introduced and experimented with new forms of practice, display, and audiences for the arts. Focusing in his writing and curatorial practice on connections between art and society, Declan McGonagle has been a prime contributor to raising the status of Irish art in the global arena. He will speak to us this afternoon about them, not us, turning the museum in an anxious world. So please join me in congratulating and welcoming Declan McGonagle to the podium.
Thanks very much, Nancy, and can I just thank you for the invitation to speak, thanks to you and to the museum. I think we would all agree that these are interesting times, and we face real challenges which we just have to turn into opportunity somehow, it seems to me. So it's interesting for me to be invited to set out some principles which underpin my own work, but also relate to this larger task in this period. And since I would argue that our inherited economic models and our inherited party political models have failed to create a whole society, or even a momentum towards that goal, then a responsibility clearly falls, in my opinion, on culture to create and sustain that momentum, and to turn in whatever direction is necessary to achieve that. I think it's also true to say that there are many institutions and many curators who are addressing these issues, but it needs to be made explicit in our definition of cultural value from this point onwards, I would argue. My own working definition of culture is that culture is whatever we make and do to add value to the quality of our lives, which includes but is not limited to the arts. So my argument, therefore, is not actually to separate out culture in any way, but to think of an ecology where the interdependence and interaction of economic, social, and cultural capital is acknowledged and provided for wherever it takes place. And art can happen anywhere. I've used the phrase for them, it's for them, not for us, in the title of this lecture as an attempt to focus the argument I want to make about the purpose of art and how and why we provide for that purpose. And if I had to provide a framing statement for my point of view, I would say that the purpose of art is to see self in other, and by so doing to create empathy. To turn towards that goal, we need to consider and compare what is now needed with what we have already in place, and our capacity or not structurally to see self in other and to speak to them, however they are defined, and not simply to speak to ourselves, however we are defined. In the lecture, I'd like to propose ways of thinking and of creating a dialectic in practice in order to meet the need that is now greater than ever. And that need is to create and sustain empathy. Because without empathy, there is no society. So the stakes are very high in this period, where it seems to me that there are concerted attempts to dismantle, to whatever degree empathy has been put in place since the Second World War, in the post-war period. Empathy is a necessity, not simply an option in an increasingly anxious world. The need for what art does, and not just what art is, has to be centred and embedded in, rather than separated from, social space, and has to be nourished in the forum as well as the temple, as a transactional and not just a consumerist process. The existing model of museum, therefore, has a crucial role to play in meeting this necessity if the model can turn to include and validate a wider relational field of participatory as well as signature practice, of reciprocal as well as rhetorical models of value in the present tense. So I'm proposing here that we think of museum as a function and not simply a place, through which the creation of meaning at the point of experience occurs in the same cognitive mode in which art is made, which would make the boundaries between artist and non-artist, between self and other, at least porous, if not erased altogether. The particular lens I want to use is my own experience, as Nancy has said, and what I learned in opening and directing the Irish Museum of Modern Art, the first national institution concerned with the collecting and programming of modern and contemporary art in Ireland. And I think it's important to realise that starting points lead to outcomes. And we started with the idea that modern art was to function as a museum of modern art in Ireland, and not as a museum of Irish modern art. This became a focus of debate a few years after the museum had opened, where various commentators expressed disappointment that it was a museum of modern art in Ireland rather than a museum of Irish modern art. But that was a conscious decision, strategic, if you like, decision, that this would be international and outward-looking rather than inward-looking. Nor was it going to be a museum of modernist art. And while these distinctions might sound Jesuitical, and I'm conscious of where I'm speaking when I use that word, might sound Jesuitical, they're really crucial differences, because far too often the idea of modern and the idea of modernist are taken as synonymous, whereas modernism and modernist is simply one way of being modern, being in the present tense. I'll talk more about this obviously as I go through and make other points. So the big question for me was, in 1990, 1991, when the museum was established and opened, what would it mean to establish a museum of modern art at the end of the 20th century? And what would it mean to establish such a museum in Ireland at a time of political violence and troubled identities? Since our starting point was a questioning rather than an acceptance of the model, we decided that our subject was finding out what it would mean to establish a museum of modern art in Ireland at the end of the 20th century that would relate to the end of century debates going on in society as well as in the culture. The proposed model, therefore, was of museum as a site of interrogation, not instead of, but alongside and in dialogue with the inherited idea of museum as a site of celebration and authority. Museum as a porous process rather than a terminus for meaning. lecture is broadly in three parts. I want to cover three sort of areas. Firstly, how the museum was established and a bit of the context and the political issues around that. Secondly, how the museum set about doing its job, as I've indicated above. And then I'll finish with a sort of short coda with a small number of images where I speculate on a basis for another kind of practice and argue for a rereading in the present tense of some key assumptions about art, what and who it is for into the future. Also to argue that this proposition, which I want to make, is actually not new, but simply represents a reconnection to what has been the function and purpose of art when considered over the long-term human project, and not just as a reflection of the relatively recent European Enlightenment. And I want to stress quickly that I am not a pre-Raphaelite, because this is about a forward, not a nostalgic momentum, in the sense that it is about reconnecting the aesthetic responsibilities of art to its ethical responsibilities, using whatever form of practice or institutional form it takes to do that. So, what would a museum look like if built around concept of shared, reciprocal meaning and participation, and not just rhetorical production and consumption? This first image is the Museum of Modern Art building. The museum is housed in the Royal Hospital Kilmainham, which is a national monument in Ireland. It was built by the English in Ireland in 1681, not as an infirmary, not as a hospital in the sense we use hospital now, but as a place of hospitality for retired soldiers in the English Army. It was built at a time when Dublin was a late medieval settlement, and it must have been an extraordinary intervention architecturally and ideologically, as well as politically and physically, sitting on high ground just beyond the main settlement of Dublin in the 1680s. Eddie McFarlane, the Irish architectural historian, has argued that it was both in its architecture and its concept was both a late medieval building but also the first classical building in Ireland. And that duality is key to how we thought about the museum. That duality is also key to what I would call the Irish mind and the concept of Irishness that we are trying to negotiate and renegotiate. A very important historical building, national monument, classical building built around a perfect 60-metre square. This is an aerial shot taken looking from the west towards the main city centre of Dublin. This building sits slightly on the edge of the city centre, and before you get into huge housing projects, social housing projects, which were built in Inchicore and Kilmainham and in Tallaght in the 1960s by the Irish state. It sits in an area of Dublin known as Dublin 8, Kilmainham and Inchicore, very underprivileged neighbourhood. And this led people to say that when the Irish government decided in 1989 that the Irish Museum of Modern Art, having taken most of the 20th century to decide to have a Museum of Modern Art, because Ireland, the Irish state anyway, has always had a love-hate relationship with modernity anyway. And lots of arguments developed over the years, but the decision wasn't made until 1989 to have a Museum of Modern Art, and the decision was made to have it in this building. This building, because it was defined as English, which was actually quite wrong because the architecture is French, it was modelled on Les Invalides. The Duke of Ormond, who commissioned the building, explicitly asked the architect to create a European building to be used as to provide hospitality for English soldiers, and it was used for that purpose right up until 1927, which is a few years just after Irish independence. But I at the time and now, I'm under no illusions as to why the Irish government decided to use this building, because the other option was a 19th century warehouse building in the Docklands, This building, having been restored using European money without a finished purpose in mind, was ready to some extent. It had to be modified, but it was essentially refurbished. Whereas the warehouse would have cost maybe 20 million to transform. So the Irish state made the right decision, perhaps for the wrong reason, in my opinion. And the right decision was, I think, articulated when a television presenter of an arts programme asked me in an interview, did I not think that the Royal Hospital was far away? And of course what he meant and what was embedded in his question was the presumption that the audience for modern art in Dublin, in Ireland, did not live in Kilmainham and Inchicore. And so people constantly, even friends, said, well, congratulations, you got the job, but sorry, you're in the wrong building, it's in the wrong part of town, and there isn't enough money to buy a collection. And I felt those were all being cited as disadvantages, but I felt that they were actually advantages because we would be forced, even if I was not inclined to do so anyway, to renegotiate exactly those issues. This is exactly the right part of town for a museum of modern art looking into the 21st century. It's exactly the right sort of building, which is not innocent, which does not pretend to be innocent. It is capable, as you'll see as we go through some of the programming aspects, it's capable of having white box spaces, as any custom-built modernist architecture would provide. It was capable of doing that. But because it couldn't be claimed to be innocent, it therefore called for a different relationship. There was no pretense of the innocence of the white box. And as Patrick Ireland, Brian O'Doherty has argued in his essays in the 60s, I think, inside the White Cube, that the White Cube isn't even an innocent space. It's everywhere and every place is ideologically charged, even if that ideology is disguised to some extent. So there was no disguising what this was. It was a controversial building in its day. From 1927 until 1985, it lay in ruins because the Irish state would not touch or invest in an English building until Ireland joined the European community in the 1970s and started to climb out from under a self-image as the victim of England, as a victim of Britain, and start to rethink, and we started to rethink ourselves as European. This, therefore, was the perfect building where those issues of identity were unavoidable and had to be addressed by an institution looking forward to the 21st century, claiming the title of a museum of modern art, which also rhymed with what was happening in contemporary art practice in terms of a redefinition or a rethinking of the definition of artist, the relationship between artist and non-artist, and the role of art in society. A huge controversy developed around the selection of this building, and when the then young architect Shay Cleary, who commissioned to transform the building into the museum, made various incredibly modest proposals to create an entrance hall and to make minor changes to some of the architectural spaces. There was a terrible controversy led by the architectural critic, now retired now, but was the environmental critic for the Irish Times, and he led a whole campaign to stop the process, which I thought was an extraordinary attitude and approach to take, because it denied the Europeanness of the process that we were engaged in. Because there are so many examples of important historical buildings being transformed in the present tense for uses in Europe, in France in particular, which echoes the architecture of this building, for uses as museums or galleries of art. So far from being in the wrong place, it was in exactly the right place to question. The idea of not being given, somebody wrote a piece in the Irish Times saying, well, of course it won't succeed as a museum of modern art because it won't have 100 million to buy in a collection, as if going shopping was how you built a collection. The very fact, I know there are no Irish civil servants here listening to what I'm saying, But the very fact that we didn't have a lot of money meant we had to work differently with artists, and we would not be going shopping. We would grow a collection. And we would grow a collection out of the incremental development of our credibility arising from relationships simultaneously with artists, with practitioners, and with the society. In this case, articulated in terms of specific relationships with the communities in Kilmainham and Inchicore. So we started with a number of questions which were dramatised even before the museum opened in the media and in public debate in Dublin, which I thought was, again, rather than a disadvantage, was actually an opportunity to get that debate into the public domain, to get an opportunity to argue that this was going to be a site of interrogation, that it wasn't going to simply repeat a formulaic approach to an Irish Museum of Modern Art. And that underpinning, that sense of agility, and yet such an apparently fixed architectural physical provision actually allowed us to think of it as a porous process, and as I said, not as a terminus for meaning. And we tried to embody this in the opening exhibition in May 1991. The title of the exhibition was Inheritance and Transformation, and it referred to both the inheritance of the Royal Hospital building, but also the inheritance of the model and models of thinking about museums of modern art, and indeed about modern art. So the question was in the title of the museum: what is it to be Irish at the end of the 20th century, looking into the 21st century? What is it to be a museum at this time? What is this thing called modern art at this time? And what could it be, taking account of what contemporary artists were doing? This is, and most of you probably aren't familiar with the architecture, but the entrance hall that was created also created this landing space. The architecture of the Royal Hospital is on three sides of the building. You see it's built around a quadrangle. There are a series of rooms, 5 metres square, ground floor and first floor. And these were the rooms used by the officers and the enlisted men who were the occupants of the hospital, of the building. So these were simplified. Very little deconstruction took place in terms of changing that, because what we had were rooms rather than spaces, with very large windows looking out both beyond the museum or into the courtyard. And this landing area was also created when Shea Cleary's proposal meant that the entrance hall was underneath this landing. So this is one of the very first relationships that one saw in the opening exhibition. And in the foreground is a work by Richard Long, the English landscape artist, who makes walks in landscapes, sometimes photographs those walks, and brings the evidence of the walk, as it were, back to the gallery. This is Kilkenny limestone, which was made specifically for that location and for the opening show, was commissioned. Richard Long makes work as a result of experience, not to describe experience. And we juxtapose that with the painting in the background, which is a Paul Henry painting from the late 1920s, Turf Stacks in Connemara, which was donated to the museum. And Paul Henry, in some ways, also takes material from the earth and makes a painting to describe experience. So that juxtaposition was typical, and that idea of juxtaposing a dialectic created in the viewer's experience of both works simultaneously, either in the same space or juxtaposed in a sequence of rooms. This is a work from a series of minimalist pieces we borrowed for the opening exhibitions from a German collector called Klaus Lefrenz. Fantastic collection of really important works by Don Judd and others. But this is the Don Judd piece. And we installed that at the end of one set of rooms on the quadrangle, the west wing. And we installed this piece by Hans Hacke, the New York-based German-American artist, which referred to the Contra guerrillas in the 1980s in Nicaragua. with the cinema lights flashing. In real life, they flashed around that sort of fake cinema entrance because Ronald Reagan was a supporter of the Contra guerrillas. And President Ronald Reagan was a B-movie star in his day. And the point here, this is a news photograph, it's not an image taken by Hans Haacke. He built the piece really to say that no matter how we define freedom fighters, left, right, whatever, the victims of the sort of process and what was going on in Central America at that time tend to be people like these. A family, the person carrying the coffin of a child to be buried after a raid on a village by the Contras. Now the juxtaposition there between Judd, who argues that there is a set of absolutes to which art to be considered important must adhere, and none of those absolutes are social. They are asocial or beyond the social, and that it is not his responsibility as an artist to engage with the social. Whereas Hans Haacke is saying it is absolutely the responsibility of an artist to engage with what is going on in the political and social sphere. And now, in presenting those two works apart, but experientially available to the viewer, as a visitor would make their way around the opening shows, it was not for me to say, as director or curator, to say from a curatorial perspective, Hans Haacke is better, whatever that means, than Don Judd, or vice versa. It's to create an opportunity for the viewer to see those different points of view and to respond themselves to those points of view. Therefore, empowering the viewer by entering that dialectic between the two ideological positions, aesthetic positions, ethical positions represented here. And that idea of juxtaposition really runs and certainly ran through and runs through my own practice, but ran through the process in development of the museum. This is a series of works made by an active retirement association from Inchicore. Before the museum opened, they used some of the spaces as a workshop for their art club, and we decided that we would show their existing works in the opening exhibition. But we would not pretend that these works were made with the same intentions as Paul Henry's or Richard Long's or Don Judd's. So we found a way to show their works where we commissioned a photographer to make photographic portraits. These were printed on boards, and a statement made by the artist as to why they took up painting, why they all worked with landscape, which is really interesting. And if you actually look at the composition, mostly from postcards, and as Marina Warner, the critic, pointed out when she visited this exhibition, she said, these are all based on rules of composition from the 17th and 18th century landscape painting, pastoral painting, foreground, middle ground, and distance, without even knowing it. Now, the idea was that we would not, by showing them alongside all of the other works, the danger was that these artists would be disempowered, would look like less. So what we exhibited there was the process. What we were exhibiting was their intention, and what the return for them was in working in this way. This is a relationship that has expanded over the years, has been picked up by the national organisation Age and Opportunity. The members of this group actually curated exhibitions in the museum. Their work was always shown in juxtaposition, sometimes made in response to other exhibitions. And it was not a pretense that this is the same, because the intentions are completely different. But a phrase that was used in the Northern Ireland peace process, which I think cracked the process, is the idea of a parity of esteem. A esteem for difference, rather than pretending that things are actually the same. That there is a relationship here by the form of this work and the other works that will be shown. In this opening period, we believed that we had to cover a certain amount of ground, that we had to challenge some presumptions by creating these juxtapositions, and the relationship of that body of work by so-called non-artists alongside work by artists. And also we had to fulfill the function of a museum, as well as attempting to interrogate the function of the museum. We had to be a museum of modern art. And one of the jobs is to do retrospective exhibitions of either disregarded figures or historical figures. This is early work by an artist called Mamie Jellett, very important in Ireland in the 30s and 40s. Very early figurative work. Very neglected artist in terms of being collected, although occupying an historical position. She then developed a style, having studied with French cubists, with Evie Hone and other Irish artists, and developed a particular language based on Cubism, late Cubism, to produce works like these. And these works were produced towards the end of her life, where she had synthesized the figuration of her early work and the sort of cubist, semi-abstract works that she produced in the middle of her career. And it was very important that an exhibition like this, of works by an artist like this, who was disregarded, especially as a woman artist, was foregrounded in the programming identity of the museum. At the same time as that exhibition, we had been working for a while with a women's resource centre in Inchicore, running workshops, talks, and we, towards the end of that year, at the same time as the Mamie Jellett exhibition was on, they created an exhibition called Unspoken Truths about their identity and their life experiences. And this was a collective work which is called The Mantle. And mantelpieces in Ireland, especially in rural parts of Ireland, the mantelpiece used to be quite high over a very open fireplace, and it's where people would keep their treasured possessions out of harm's way, out of reach. Not so much money, although there would be some money there, but valuable objects, including holy objects. So the group of women recreated this idea of the mantle using fabric and small objects that they valued put on that. And this was a work that was made collectively during that period. During the early years, I think we set about, as I said, the museum doing its job as a museum of modern art, and at the same time creating the opportunity for that function, that identity and that process to be interrogated. This is a video work and a photographic installation by Alana O'Kelly, then a mid-generation artist who had been working for some time in performance and documentation. And this was the mid-90s, when there was a terrible famine in Somalia. And Alana was very struck by the television images of famine in Somalia and the approaching 150th anniversary of the famine in Ireland. And she had just had her third child, I think, at that stage, and was very conscious of those mother and child images on television and remembering the famine in Ireland at the same time. So she created this installation. We commissioned this video work. It was based on the changing images where hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. And this image, which I was just explaining to Rachel, has been bleached out in some weird way and turned very yellow, but it was a much more sombre light than that. This is what's known as a famine mound in the west of Ireland in County Mayo. It looks like a very normal sand dune, but it was actually full of human bones, where mass graves during the famine would be created like this. Now, weirdly, a year after the 150th anniversary in 1995, 97 was the original famine period, this was completely washed away by a huge storm. I don't know if that's poetic justice or something. Some sort of synchronicity was happening there. And this was lit with a sort of votive candle below. In the same period, we borrowed a set of works from the Tate. And I don't want to overstate the relationship, any relationship between the famine and the emaciated figures of Giacometti, because Giacometti was working in the 50s, essentially, in the post-war period, which was another period of anxiety, post-atomic. Before we went nuclear, it was post-atomic bomb anxiety at that time, and a very existential sense of the world. And we borrowed a suite of works, small suite of works that had been donated to the Tate for an exhibition. So within that period, we were showing a sort of mid-generation Irish artist, a huge established historical figure in the ways that one should do as a museum of modern art, and also then we were showing younger Irish artists. This is a work, a video screen work looks like a traditional Irish landscape, damp, raining, wet. But it's one image in a two-screen installation by Caroline McCarthy, who was then a young artist. This was mid-90s. And if this was playing now, what would you see? What you would see happening occasionally in each screen is Caroline's head appear in the screen and then drop out. It was in the show. Yeah, yeah. And what she was saying as a young Irish woman was that there was no place for her as a young Irish woman in this traditional idea of Irishness, this almost cliched idea of the Irish landscape. I think for such an early work, an incredibly mature reflection on that issue of identity. And we were donated this work by the art critic Dorothy Walker. It's a very early work by Willie Doherty. Very simple work, but again using the metaphor of landscape, and in each image the sky, longing, the land, lamenting. And what Willie is really saying here is that we have givens. We have the sky, landscape is there, and we project onto it meanings and values. That it is not there. It is projected on. It is a cultural act to project meanings and value onto experience like this. And a huge part of the Irish relationship with the land is based on the idea of lamenting because of a political history and a longing. And it runs through Irish traditional culture and is a subject of huge renegotiation and negotiation by Irish artists up to today. These are shots of the Royal Hospital. That's the north wing, which contains a banqueting hall. This was a commission for Lawrence Weiner, the American artist. This is a text that he has used in a number of different situations, and he installed this text across the building within the courtyard. So you have, first of all, the artist may construct the work, series of propositions and proposals. The work may be fabricated. This is an Irish translation of the text as well. And the work need not be built. And it was interesting that a reviewer for a publication in Ireland wondered why I was allowed to destroy the Royal Hospital building. This isn't a permanent work, it was temporary. And we had to go through handstands to negotiate with the Office of Public Works, who are the government agency responsible for historic monuments, to really fix these wooden texts into the fabric of the building, and we negotiated that successfully. But the critics' view was that we had put Weiner's artwork onto the building. And what he was missing was the whole point of this work, was that this work that Lawrence Weiner was bringing to something that was already an artwork, that was already full of meaning, and was already legible to any audience that would show up to have this experience. And he was adding something to that to create a third reading, to make you consider, reflect upon, question the presumptions and the acceptance of the architectural identity of the Royal Hospital building. And he has done that a piece using those same texts. So here, the meaning does not lie in the artifact. It's a bit like a musical score. The music lies in playing the score. And that's exactly how this sort of work functions. This has to be played by a viewer. It does not exist as art until it is experienced. You cannot separate the concept of art from its experience. And when artworks are stored or taken off display and put in a storeroom, in my view, they stop being art. They're potential art. The artifact becomes art when it is experienced, when it is played. And the museum's job is to create opportunities for that encounter and for meaning to be created in that moment of experience, as I said before, and ideally in the same cognitive mode as the making of the work. We had an opportunity to use some grant and aid from the state for tourism And we skewed the brief to create a series of artist studios and living accommodation. So once we had the opportunity, a couple of years after opening, for a capital investment, we decided that we would invest in a process, a way of exhibiting process, through creating studios which artists would make a proposal for. It was called the Artist Work Programme. We didn't use the word residency. They would make a proposal for a programme of work for a short or long period, with accommodation or without accommodation, depending on their needs. But that they would be available not every day, but regularly for public conversations, either on a casual basis or a pre-programmed basis. This is not a dramatically new idea by us, but it was a very important sort of reinvestment of the idea of process. As soon as we had more capital, rather than building new galleries, we converted a series of old stable buildings at the museum into studios. Then, approaching 1994-95, we thought that we needed to restate the museum's intentions. So we created an exhibition called From Beyond the Pale. It was a season of exhibitions, actually running over a period of about 6 months, which would include as its central exhibition works by Duchamp, Picasso, Joseph Beuys, Andy Warhol, and Jeff Koons. And it was interesting, the dealer visited the exhibition, and Hester Van Rohen, who was a dealer in London, but whose father was a dealer for Picasso, and she was very offended that we were showing Jeff Koons alongside Picasso. And she said, are you saying that Jeff Koons is as good as Picasso? And I said, no, but maybe Picasso is as bad as Jeff Koons. No, that's very trite, but it was that sort of conversation. But that was the point. I mean, she was arriving with the presumption that Picasso was untouchable and was in this reified space. Whereas I think it's the job of the museum to create the opportunity to either just believe that. Many people said to me that the building was wrong because the rooms are too small, which I found extraordinary. It was as if their idea, the idea that it wasn't a traditional modernist white box, would somehow prevent showing, as somebody said to me, well, you won't be able to show large abstract paintings there, which we did. We showed a big retrospective of Sean Scully. But a sort of blindness had intervened in some way, which is about ways of seeing and ways of understanding, which are really, really interesting for people I felt should have known better. Joseph Beuys in the foreground. So this was the entire, 2/3 of the east wing of the building. Jeff Koons, very typical work, obviously. And a piece by Warhol of Jean-Michel Basquiat. The very first thing, of course, is that they're all male artists. They're cast as heroic figures of the 20th century. I think that begs enough questions. So in order to raise a question over that, we installed a series of these stone carvings, Irish stone carvings that are held in the National Museum, called Sheila na gigs. They're thought to be from around the 12th century, certainly the Romanesque period, and they were found in the walls of fortified houses or castles, sometimes over the doorways of churches, and they're display figures, where the female genitalia are displayed by the figure. And their function and purpose is still to some extent contested. And for a long time, the National Museum in Ireland couldn't show these pieces, for a very long time, until relatively recently, because they were so explicit. And the reading of what they were and what they did and what they were supposed to do was contested. And that's exactly why we exhibited them alongside the male heroes of the artists I've just run through, because they embody a question. Because the idea It is thought that their use was to ward off evil, with evil. That the building would be protected by these figures because the female was evil. I'm shorthanding, I'm sure, a whole philosophy, but essentially the female was evil, particularly in display, and would ward off evil. So what we did was, with the National Museum curators, we installed these pieces in the relative positions they would have been installed in their original buildings. So where they were installed high, they were in the original buildings. We created tall plinths, and to get to, as it were, the male heroes, you had to pass through the Sheila na gigs first. So again, it's that idea of the juxtaposition. The point about the Sheila na gigs, while they might be materially from the 12th century, their meaning is present tense. And in a juxtaposition like that, it actually creates... Now, this is a piece that I wanted to borrow for that exhibition. It's by Picasso, and it's called La Pesos. And when the curator came from the Picasso Museum accompanying the works, she agreed that this work should have been in the show because it's perfect. She was going to go off and find out, had Picasso ever seen the Sheila na gig figures. Such a correspondence she saw between that work and other works that she knew of Picasso's and the Sheila na gigs. But I think that's a connection at the level of ideas and thinking, not necessarily in terms of material evidence. We also had a series of installations and exhibited works, borrowed works, some commissioned by contemporary artists. The spinning figure is a blackamoor figure by Lee Jaffe. The other pieces are by Sonia Boyce, who is a London-based artist of Caribbean descent. This is an installation by Marina Abramovich, crystal shoes and Korean virgin's hair. A work by Vong Phai Phanit, a Laotian artist living in London. The neon script is Laotian script, where he took up the floorboards of one of the ground floor rooms and installed the Laotian script, which lit the whole room up as a red process. This is an Irish artist, Alice Marr. She collected human hair from hairdressers and barbers and created this tower. And you can see, and her point was, again, the power of the female, because further along the exhibition spaces were the Sheila na gigs. And she felt that hair, particularly in abundance, female hair in abundance, almost seems feral, or is defined as feral, and is certainly defined as other in some within the hierarchy of power in our system. We also recommissioned, I say recommissioned because this is a series of billboards based on a commission that I did when I was at the ICA in the mid-80s by Les Levine, an Irish artist who has lived in New York for many, many years, since the 60s. And his idea was, in the context of and in relation to the Troubles in Northern Ireland, that he would make a series of billboards that would, in media space, deal with the media's representation of violence. So his very simple idea was that if you blast, execute, kill, starve a human being, you're blasting, executing, killing God. It was almost it was actually, if you like, and one of the things he was trying to do in the London project was to see if it was possible to make religious art at the end of the 20th century. Now, it caused a huge furore in London at the time, and we ended up having to take a High Court injunction to insist that the billboard company, who were paid to put the billboards up, would continue to put them up because the police had told them to stop in case of a breach of the peace, because lots of people get very upset. And I ended up having endless conversations on the phone by people who declared they were Christians and objected to these. And interestingly, when I explained the background and the fact that this could be read and would be read most easily as a pro-Christian message, instead of becoming less angry or being mollified, they became more angry. I believe because they had missed the point and they saw the gap between their claim and what was actually happening. Having done that project in the context of the Beyond the Pale season, we recommissioned Les to do these works around Dublin. And exactly the same thing happened. But we prepared the ground better this time in that I briefed all the main churches, official groups, unofficial groups, that this project was coming, because we were taken a bit by surprise in London. So I wrote to every bishop, archbishop, every minister, everybody I could think of, and say, look, this project's coming, here's the background, we're happy to engage in debate, it's meant to stimulate debate. And it was very interesting how the media, when these billboards went out in situ and we got some complaints, immediately started to ring up those people looking for negative responses, and they didn't get it. We actually did end up in the High Court in Dublin. We were taken to court by a very conservative Catholic group of Catholic lawyers actually, and it got as far as the High Court, but was thrown out because it was going to be a blasphemy case, and it was made very clear that the particular judge on the day would be damned if he was going to be asked to rule on blasphemy in Ireland at the end of the 20th century. But what saved the day was the fact that the Advertising Standards Authority defined these as not as advertisements but as art. It therefore took it out of that, it seemed to take it out of that context. But what was interesting about the reaction was that we understand that these words were added by a group of young Catholics who went out in the dead of night, ladders and paste, and stuck these words over Les's texts: Creator God, fear God, turn to God, which I thought was an extraordinary intervention on their part, stimulated by the work, and in some senses completed the work. As far as Les was concerned, this actually completes the work because it has drawn out from someone. Now, you can say, well, it's vandalism or it's not, and it could easily have been vandalism, but I actually think it takes us into another kind of space about where meaning and value lies and is created, and by whom. And you can see that that's quite an elaborate bit of work on a whole series of billboards. Not every single one. I thought I'd just put in this one to finish off the piece on Les, because this is from London. And the piece on the left, Attack God, was vandalised and ripped down at least 5 or 6 times in this street, Elephant and Castle, just across Westminster Bridge. The Rambo poster was untouched over the same period, which I think is really interesting in terms of how people can read signs. Another high point, just conscious of time, another high point for us, I think, when the museum was really doing this job was when we did this retrospective of Andy Warhol's work. All the sort of great hits in a sense, but we called it After the Party, and the idea was to pick up on a Thomas Crow essay where he was asking for a reconsideration of Warhol, not as a trickster or a joker, but as a fundamentally serious artist using non-traditional means, but to explore traditional issues about the nature and meaning of human experience. And we included all the sort of major works. But where the juxtaposition worked in an interesting way was when I was negotiating with Mark Francis, the curator of the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh. He took me to see the capsules that Warhol created, you know, the cardboard boxes where he put in newspapers and things every day, every week, and these exist in the store. And what was in the store were not only his drawings when he was a draftsman and an illustrator in New York, there was also drawings by his mother, Julia Warhola. And when I saw those, I thought that's really interesting, because Julia Warhola used to put Andrew Warhola and his brother at the kitchen table every night where they drew cats and angels. And her drawings were of cats and angels. And the point we were trying to make was that before there was Andy Warhol, there was Andrew Warhola. That Andy Warhol was the creation, a creation, in a sense, a whole persona created quite deliberately. And like the subject matter of his work, which dealt with fame, as he had said at one point, when I look out my window, I see fame, money, violence, and that's the subject that I paint and that I make work about. Alongside the Andy Warhol retrospective, we had this project by the women's group from Inchicore, which was about violence against women, again on the landing area. So one had to come through this to get to the Andy Warhol retrospective. And this was a project based, as I said, on violence against women. This was a chandelier. Most of the violence against women, or a lot of violence, takes place around the kitchen table. Family meal often is a starting point for that, and these are implements that were used in cases in Dublin of violence against women taking place in the domestic setting. This project was led by a Canadian printmaker who was on the Artist Work programme called Rochelle Kaplan, who worked with the women's group in making collective pieces around these themes, but also commemorative piece for women who in a particular period when this project was underway had been killed in domestic circumstances. And this piece, which we acquired for the museum's collection, was about a sort of voyeurism, somebody looking. This was projected onto a hospital screen with a hospital bed behind in one of the 5 metre square rooms in the museum. And we decided to acquire this collection. It went through exactly the same process as any other work that we would acquire, an acquisitions committee, recommendation by staff and so forth. The value was then shared out among the group of women who had made the work. But the reason I'm stalling on this is that when I show this image in museum conferences, often, and less so now, but in the past quite a lot, there is often a debate that ensues about the validity of a work like this entering a national collection of modern and contemporary art, as if somehow this doesn't belong because it was made in the way it was made, in the context it was made. And I think there's that is a very interesting juxtaposition of ideas about validity and the validity of work and what constitutes a valid acquisition process for a museum. At the same time, we did a sort of mini retrospective of Kiki Smith's work. So you had the Warhol retrospective on one hand, the unspoken truths, as it were, in the middle of the museum, and on the other wing, the Kiki Smith mini retrospective covering 10 years' work. And what was interesting was that Kiki decided that, and this is the right way up, this is a piece called The Lith, which again is conjuring up that idea of the female as feral, climbing upside down a wall. And through the rooms, she selected a series of pieces covering about 10 years' practice, which would represent in this particular period, a dissolution of the figure into the ground of other works that she was beginning to make at that time using glass and glass animals. So it was as if the singularity of the figure dissolved into the ground. But interestingly here, she insisted on no captions, no dates assigned to each work, no introductory panel, no text in the catalogue, which would just be a set of illustrations. Now, obviously, Kiki Smith has a position, would be known. She's not an invisible personality, but just in terms of the experiential process, it was left to the viewer to negotiate the rooms and to negotiate meaning from the experience. This is the sort of coda I want to finish with now, just a set of work, really a set of references. This was media coverage in the late 70s of the Tate Gallery's exhibition, having acquired the work several years before, of Carl Andre's bricks. Notorious as, if you read any of the histories, it's an absolutely classic case of a media storm around the acquisition or the display of a piece of contemporary art by a museum. This is Equivalent 8, one of a series of pieces that Carl Andre had done, bought by the Tate in 72, shown a couple of times, and then in 1978, because a particular journalist had gone to review one exhibition which had not opened, and was annoyed, wandered through the collection galleries and wrote a piece about the Carl Andre bricks. Classic sort of cynical tabloid response, but the media storm was extraordinary at the time. And the interesting thing about this, and the reason why I want to use this work, is about the idea, this is the simplest possible action that a human being can undertake, to stack a given object on top of another, in this case 120 fire bricks. The point about this was, of course, that it's extremely knowing, in that it becomes an artwork when it is assembled and shown in a museum. But just as the Lawrence Wiener was an artwork because the text was on the Royal Hospital building. That when we take the text away, it stops being art. That when this is, as it were, this 120 fire bricks stacked in the car park or in the storeroom is not a work of art, because the work of art here involves a person deciding to go to the Tate Millbank as it was then. It's now Tate Britain, quite a different orientation with Tate Modern, but then contemporary art and modern art and historical art was together in Tate Millbank. The idea was that by the time you got to experience this work, you had negotiated the museum, including your own ideas, assumptions, prejudices, likes and dislikes about a museum. You had to go up the steps and through the classical portico of Tate Millbank and you had to decide to go there. And you had to then walk through, in those days, and you walked up the main hallway in Tate Millbank, and you went right for contemporary work and left for historical work, historical British work. So you'd already, as it were, articulated certain sorts of presumptions, even unconsciously, before you got to this work. So this is about context. The meaning of this work lies in its relationship with its context. Context creates meaning in this particular case. I mean, there's a quote by Carl Andre where he says, "A place is an area within an environment which has been altered in such a way as to make the general environment more conspicuous." And what he's making more conspicuous here is our understandings of museums of modern art. A very powerful model of a museum of modern art is the very well-known, it was a catalogue cover. The actual catalogue, I think, was from Cubism to abstract art. But this was Alfred Barr, the first director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and his chart of the inevitability through various cultures, through other cultures, towards the manifest destiny, if you like, of geometric and non-geometric art, in particular the art of mid-20th century New York and the art that MoMA acquired and privileged to some extent at that time. This was a reordering of experience, almost to make it look as if the other work was simply rehearsal for the real thing, and the real thing was non-geometric and geometric art being produced and being celebrated. What it represents is a desocialization of art, which was a conscious objective in the establishment of MoMA, which was established by a group of families around the Rockefeller family, with the explicit intention of desocializing art and disconnecting the aesthetic responsibilities of art from its ethical responsibilities. And I just want to refer back to this brilliant High Renaissance work by Hans Holbein, 1533, court painter to Henry VIII, the French ambassadors. It's in the National Gallery in London. It's called The Ambassadors. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the work. A celebration of wealth and power, a political painting, all about man's dominance of nature, all the navigational instruments. You'd need to be a Freemason to disentangle all the references here, and I'd refer you to John North's book on this. If you want to disentangle, the references are huge, but I'm using this as an illustration because of the device that Holbein uses here, which is the anamorphic skull in the foreground. And the realism here, of course, is deeply political, because what the collector is collecting is both the artist's skill, but the representation of the collector's wealth and power. And to communicate that, the painting of silk had to look like silk. Almost, if you touched it, make you believe you were feeling silk. Therefore, realism was a political device in making this work. So the question has to be, in a period when it was perfectly acceptable for legible memento mori to be put into paintings of powerful figures, perfectly acceptable to do that, why did Holbein use a different optic in this case? Because, as you probably know, or if you don't, if you move 11 paces to the right, you can read the skull clearly and accurately and properly. Otherwise, it's an illegible, formless mass in the middle of the painting. So why the different optic? And my argument is, and what I take from this is that what Holbein did was hardwired into this painting his own deconstruction of its first meaning. And its first meaning are, these are extremely powerful men who represent a modernist sensibility. It is not a modern work, it is a modernist work, because it represents that sensibility. And for me, the definition of modernism is that things happen as a result of the actions of man, rather than the actions of God. Now, that is actually religious belief disguised as secular belief, because it believes that there is a set of absolute. As Don Judd believed, there's a set of absolutes, and you adhere to those, and you have a destination. You have a manifest destiny in that context, and that we're on our way to something. So that's the modernist set of mind, and I think it's present in this work. But hardwired into one of the best, if not the best, example of a high Renaissance painting, a modernist sensibility, Holbein has included a participatory dimension to the construction of meaning and value in this work. That anybody can deconstruct the first meaning by physically, again, doing the simplest action, which is physically repositioning yourself relative to the painting, and you undermine its first reading. You create a third reading, and you create that reading. So you become a co-producer of meaning with Holbein in this work. Now, years ago, the National Gallery used to have a sign telling you to move 11 paces. They don't do that anymore because all the Japanese tourists are actually over there taking their photographs. That's terrible stereotyping, but it does seem to be. It does, and so they don't have to put a sign there anymore. So the point I'm making here is that hardwired into something that looks absolutely modernist. And Holbein had no concept of public museums. This was not meant for public display. This was given to the collector. It only came into the National Gallery's collection in the 1890s via a circuitous route through the English aristocracy, French aristocracy to English aristocracy into the National Gallery. So I think it's very interesting that an artist like that hardwired into this something that we are capable of reading in a particular way in the present. Because in my view, all art is contemporary because we read it in the present tense. I don't know what it's like to have been alive in 1533. We don't eat the same food, we don't dress the same, we don't think the same way. So we can't ever be back there. We must read this in the present tense. So I'm taking this idea of the creation of the third reading as a metaphor for the broader argument I'm making. And it is not just a modernist argument. The medieval manuscripts, the marginalia in medieval manuscripts, actually I think functions in exactly the same way as the skull in the Holbein painting. That you have the piety of the text problematized by the profanity of the marginalia. And the easy story used to be that this was done by monks and the scribes who were bored on a wet Tuesday afternoon. And it's not. Michael Camille has written a wonderful book, Images on the Edge, where he argues that these images are there deliberately to give the reader a choice. And the choice is to choose piety over profanity. But you need the profanity. And I'm thinking of the Sheila and the Gigs when I think of profanity as well. You need both processes to be present in order for the reader, the viewer, to be empowered to become a co-producer of meaning. So this process, and I think we could go back to cycladic sculptures 10,000 years ago. I think for as long as human beings have understood their humanity through art and its understanding, this duality has existed. And I want to finish with this. I promise I'll finish with this. 2 minutes. This is an image from Belfast at the height of the Troubles in the mid-1980s. And it's an image of a British Army personnel carrier which would regularly park at this junction of a number of streets running together in West Belfast, which was is a Republican area, and then was the subject and the setting for a lot of violence, as you can see. And by parking there, that vehicle could observe 3 or 4 streets together. And what somebody then decided to do was paint an Armalite rifle on this wall The Armalite rifle was designed by the American Army for use in Vietnam. It was very light, and it broke down into two parts, could be easily concealed. But in the mid-70s, with the ending of the Vietnam War, a lot of these weapons went onto the black market and ended up in the hands of the IRA in Northern Ireland. So the Armalite rifle was synonymous with the IRA, with Republican violence, with insurgency, with rebellion. So what the person who painted this, which is extremely accurate apparently, what they were doing was creating exactly the same juxtaposition. You have the first reading of the power of the military vehicle, parked where it was, powerfully observing, ready to take action, being undermined, if you like, by the addition of the Armalite. And I'm not suggesting the person who painted that, or even the person who took the photograph understanding what was happening, that this was being offered to the person who was standing where the photographer was standing. It wasn't me. Because that's where a stone thrower would be standing, to throw stones or other things at the army vehicle. So this person knew exactly who they were talking to in exactly the same way as Holbein knew who he was talking to by creating the imagery he created. Again, this isn't art. It's not necessarily art, but it is something. It's about meaning and the construction of meaning, and the idea that somebody can be a co-producer of meaning even if they have not touched the material themselves that is involved in creating that experience. So I just wanted to end with that image, which is completely unlike the Holbein, the process of the Holbein, or indeed some of the processes that we are engaged in museum culture. But that juxtapositioning, that first reading, second reading, third reading, which is a reciprocal space rather than a rhetorical space, seems to me to be essential if we are to create, as I said at the very beginning, a relationship with social space which is going to be the only guarantee for the sustainability of the museum model for the future. Thank you very much.